Okay, let's just dive right into this. When you hear the name Santiago Bernabéu, what immediately pops into your head? For millions of people all over the globe, it's that world-famous five-star UEFA stadium right in the heart of Spain. You know the one. It's an absolute architectural marvel. It holds 85,000 roaring fans, features a pristine pitch, and has literally hosted some of the most glamorous matches in the entire history of football. But, well, today's explainer isn't about architecture, and it's not about modern football tactics either. We're actually doing a pretty sharp pivot here. We are going to look way past the bright floodlights and the perfect grass to uncover the hidden, honestly deeply complex history of the actual, real-life man that this monumental stadium is named after. So who was Santiago Bernabéu, really? That's the big question guiding our entire journey today. Because making that mental leap from the glitzy modern stadium we all know to the actual historical figure, well, it's quite a leap. We're talking about a man whose life was completely, inextricably intertwined with Real Madrid, on every conceivable level. He wasn't just some honorary figurehead. He played for the club, he managed the club, and he eventually presided over it for decades. He was the absolute driving force, the true patriarch of the white institution. But beneath that legendary footballing resume lies a deeply political and highly controversial past that has, for the most part, stayed completely out of the mainstream spotlight. Section 1, Beyond the Stadium, The Origins. Now, to really understand the man, we have to start right at the beginning. Santiago Bernabéu de Este was born in Almansa, Albacete, back in June of 1895. When he was just 5 years old, his family moved to El Escorial, and that right there is where his absolute obsession with football was ignited, largely thanks to his older brothers. And he wasn't just a casual fan either. He actually defended the colors of Real Madrid on the pitch, starting at the incredibly young age of 14, and he played all the way until he hung up his boots in 1927. After his playing days were over, his roots in the club just kept growing deeper. He served as a board member until 1935. But as you might guess from the timeline, this period of sports administration was about to be abruptly and violently interrupted by the outbreak of war. Moving on to Section 2, the Francoist corporal during the Civil War. All right, let's shift our lens to the historical reality of Spain in 1936. When the Spanish Civil War erupted, Bernabéu's life literally changed overnight. He was a known monarchist and a sympathizer of the CETA, which was a coalition of conservative, anti-communist, and Catholic political parties. Because of those specific political leanings, he initially chose to flee into exile when the conflict broke out. And it's right here at this moment that we are forced to look at him not as a sports executive, but as a man caught up in the incredibly violent political currents of his era. Now, looking at this timeline, it's honestly wild how fast his trajectory shifted. In 1936, like we just said, he goes into exile for political reasons. But fast forward just one short year to 1937. The war is causing immense destruction, and he makes a massive, life-altering decision. He actually enlists as a volunteer in the nationalist or rebel faction. Keep in mind he was nearly 42 years old at the time. He gets placed in the 150th Division under the command of General Agustín Muñoz Grandes. This specific division had quite a reputation for being implacable, and they took part in the major offensive against Catalonia. By April of 1938, his unit entered the city of Lleida victorious. And this timeline essentially wraps up in February of 1939, where Bernabéu himself actually participated in the parade of the victorious Francoist troops, marching right through the streets of Barcelona. Because he was, relatively old for a frontline soldier, Bernabéu was assigned specifically to information and logistics work, and he eventually reached the rank of corporal. Now, the historical records show he wasn't exactly eager to talk about this period in great detail later on in his life. He did, however, go on the record to claim that his specific unit committed 0 atrocities during the war. He also shared a pretty harrowing near-death experience from those days. But interestingly, it wasn't from enemy fire. He was almost killed by friendly fire when soldiers from another nationalist battalion actually confused him for a spy. It's just a really stark reminder of the chaotic, perilous reality he was navigating back then. Section 3, Regime and Presidency, focusing on his political contacts. So here is the absolutely crucial pivot. How did this turbulent wartime experience translate into his post-war civilian life? Well, Bernabéu had actually earned a law degree back when he was 20, but it was really his military service that became the game changer. It allowed him to cultivate this network of incredibly influential friendships within the new regime. He strategically used those wartime connections to position himself brilliantly in the socio-political landscape of post-war Spain. And you can see the direct outcomes of those carefully cultivated relationships almost immediately. Once the war ended, he didn't just casually stroll back into football. First, he became a civil servant in the Ministry of Finance. Having those high-level ties to the regime undoubtedly smoothed the path for his return to the Real Madrid board, which eventually led to his appointment as club president in September of 1943. And just look at the immediate results. Being viewed so favorably by the new regime, he used his contacts to rapidly cut through the post-war bureaucracy. He managed to secure the construction of the new Chamartín Stadium, which was astonishingly inaugurated by December of 1947, right in the middle of a seriously harsh post-war economic era. But hey, the influence of his network definitely didn't stop at just building infrastructure. Let's talk about the famous Di Stéfano case of 1953. This was a hugely contested, incredibly bitter transfer battle between Real Madrid and FC Barcelona over Alfredo Di Stéfano, who would become one of the greatest players in the history of the sport. According to historical accounts, Bernabéu's privileged political connections were absolutely instrumental in getting this dispute resolved in favor of Real Madrid. He received crucial backing from the Ministry of the Movement and, quite notably, from the exact man who had been his general back in the 150th Division, Muñoz Grandes, who by 1953 had risen to become the extremely powerful Minister of the Army. Which brings us to Section 4, the controversial rivalry in his own words. Historians widely describe Bernabéu as governing Real Madrid with a draconian pulse, a leadership style uniquely shaped by his bold character in the severe era he lived in, and he actively fed the rivalry with FC Barcelona. But rather than rely on hearsay or rumors, the most objective way to really grasp his specific worldview regarding this rivalry and Catalan identity in general is to look directly at the historical record. We are going to examine his exact recorded words. Take a look at this deeply controversial public statement he made in 1968. He literally said, and I quote, "Those who say I don't love Catalonia are wrong. I love and admire it very much in spite of the Catalans." We're presenting this exactly as it was documented. It's a statement that really needs no embellishment, right? It perfectly illustrates the immense friction and the highly politicized perspective he brought to his role as a public figure in Spanish sports. And for the record, he never retracted that statement. He actually followed that up almost immediately with another highly revealing quote. He stated, quote, "The one I truly admire is Vila Reyes. Just for presiding over a club in Catalonia called Espanyol, he is worthy of admiration." This perfectly captures how his deep-seated political worldviews seamlessly bled into his public commentary on football. For Bernabéu, the very identity and even just the name of a football club in a specific geographic region was a matter of intense political alignment and admiration. And the textual evidence wraps up with what is perhaps his most explicit statement on regional superiority, made just a few days after those previous quotes. He asserted, quote, "The Castilians are historically the most badass and complete Spaniards. The Castilian language has spread throughout the world, and from it have been born ideas that have made Spain great. And I'm sorry for the Catalans, Galicians, and Basques, but the Castilians have always been smarter, and on the battlefield they have always bested them." Honestly, this leaves zero ambiguity about the fiercely nationalistic and regionalist views held by the man who is steering the world's most famous football club. So that brings us to a final, pretty provocative thought to chew on. Today, in this explainer, we've moved way beyond just a grassy pitch in a glowing stadium. We traced a man's path from a teenage footballer to an exiled political sympathizer, to a volunteer soldier in a brutal civil war, to a highly connected executive whose political worldview fundamentally shaped the foundations of modern footballing rivalries. It really begs the question, how do political history and sports intertwine forever in the legacy of a single name? The next time you hear a match being broadcast from that iconic five-star stadium, remember the complex, politically charged history of the man whose name is literally etched right into the stone. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history behind the monuments.